We continue with the broadcast this morning, and we are now focusing on COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. And joining us this morning is researcher Ashraf Patel, looking at Africa, some of the key issues for Africa in the global south. Ashraf, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome.
Walaikum salam, Inayat and listeners. Hope you're well.
Yes, another COP forum in the UAE. And Ashraf, you and I have had many a discussion with regard to these COP forums or these COP summits that have been taking place. And this time around, I see there's going to be a lot of focus on things like fossil fuels and all sorts of things as well. But again, Africa under the spotlight, the global south will be under the spotlight. Just your thoughts ahead of the COP28 summit?
Yes, Inayat. Look, it's a huge, massive bureaucratic exercise over a period of 2 weeks. But before I sort of dive into the COP28 discussions, if we look at the setting, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, just over the weekend, Abu Dhabi hosted the Formula One Grand Prix. And if you looked and you assessed that kind of sport, Formula One, which is heavily dependent on fuel, oil, fossil fuel, gas, it gives some indication as to the Gulf states in what is basically called double talk. So, on one hand, Abu Dhabi as a host is hosting COP28, but of course, on the other hand, it is the leading nation in terms of fossil fuel revenues. Now, that contradiction sits very starkly as the leaders of the world descend onto Dubai this next week to discuss and agree on fairly fundamental agreements regarding climate change, emissions, etc. So I think it's a good symbolic contradiction that on the one hand it's business as usual for the Gulf states, on the other hand they seemingly trying to be seen as champions of green technology. So that would be quite interesting as we go into the next 10 days of COP28 negotiations.
Well, sure. And also, I think what is interesting is we've just learned about how the UAE is actually planning to use this its role in terms of hosting this these climate talks and COP28. And apparently, there have been some leaked documents showing that fossil fuel deals with 15 nations will be on the cards as well. And these are obviously going to be used for business talks as well. So again, making oil deals where on the one hand you're hosting this, and apparently this is from quite a reliable source, where one looks at business. You mentioned the entertainment part as well, the Grand Prix in Abu Dhabi, but yeah, we're talking about business talks as well. And yeah, we question the fact as to how serious are these summits in terms of genuine, effecting genuine climate change.
Yes. Look, Inayat, a lot of international relations scholars have decried the wanton promotion of business interests in all UN forums. It's not just at the COP processes. You look at every United Nations forum, whether it's trade talks, whether it's biodiversity, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, all these major forums in annual conferences are completely dominated by what is called the business forums. And it is the business corporations generally that are setting the trend. Now, what we have here is two powerful lobbies, and both of them are not good for the world and for Africa. The first, of course, we all know, is the fossil fuel, oil, and mining industry that is a very powerful lobby in the world and that has dominated the UN Sustainable Development Talks from the 70s already. So, when the World Business Council on Sustainable Development was formed in the early 80s, this lobby has grown and grown over the years to take over a lot of the UN policy functions. And more recently, you had what is called the Green Renewable Lobby. This lobby purportedly speaks on behalf of climate, or sets itself up as a champion of the earth and sustainable development. But it is also a very specific lobby that engages the UN system and the UN COP system to promote what is called renewable energy technologies. And here we see Europe and the US especially um, are promoters of renewable energy purely because their companies are leading exporters of renewable technology, be it solar, be it windmills, etc., etc. Now, these two lobbies are dominating the discourse, and it's less about, let's say, national countries, smaller nations, civil society, unions are left out of this important debate on the just transition. So, yes, two very powerful lobbies. It's if you like, two elephants that are fighting in the room, and the grass is suffering. So, this is the scenario at COP28 this week.
Yes. Now, just focusing Ashraf on Africa and the global south, what are some of the key issues?
Well, the big ticket items for this year's COP is, let's start with the big terminology, the loss and damage funds. Now, the loss and damage funds has been on the agenda since Paris 2015, for the last 7 years. And believe it or not, every year the northern nations promise that they are going to contribute significantly to the loss and damage funds. But in the last few years, even though we've seen floods in Mozambique, in Pakistan, in Philippines, we've seen drought, we've seen typhoons, we've seen climate disasters across the world. None of the northern nations, can you believe it, after 7 or 8 years, have actually committed any funding into the loss and damage fund. Instead, what we hear now is what is called green financing. And green financing basically is merely commercial banks looking at a profit opportunity, working with the IMF and World Bank to extend loans to third world countries under the guise of green. So, what we see now, quite concerningly, is a new form of green imperialism under the guise of green funding or green financing. And South Africa is one of those guinea pig countries where the G7 has supposedly promoted a just energy transition. And this just energy transition, the so called $8.5 billion package, is not loss and damage funds. It's not a loan, it's not grants, it's actually loan agreements that is repayable with interest. Now, that means in a phase where most African economies are in debt, this kind of just energy transition financing is going to push many African countries further into debt. So we now entering a new debt trap. And for African nations that are vulnerable to climate change, it's going to get even worse. So this is the contradiction of the just energy financing, or what is called green financing.
Well, Ashraf, we're going to have to obviously we'll look at what transpires, and I'm sure we'll have one or two more engagements with regard to the summit in itself. But unfortunately, time is of the essence, and we say Jazakallah to you for your time this morning, and we definitely will touch base on the issue of COP28. I'm sure when we see what develops over the next week or two, and we will then take a look at some of the other in-depth issues that we need to look at more specifically as well. But for now, we thank you. Jazakallah for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.